Hi, I'm Chelsea Haig, and I'm so sorry that I couldn't make it to Lethbridge to talk with you guys about some of these issues in person, but really happy to have the opportunity to share some of these concerns over video. So I'll be talking to you a little bit today about my work on youth media participation and how the nonprofit shapes what young people do and experience in terms of media production. So I have a real concern for social justice and for democratic practice, and I'll talk a little bit about that in my framework for thinking about how young people do social justice and democratic practice through media production. And then I'll give you some specific examples from the work that I have done. And then at the very end, I'll wrap up by sharing just a short little video that I've made that gets at some of these issues about youth and media and global and local networks. So my work really centers on doing media with young people, particularly because we've seen a really unparalleled rise in access to participatory media, and that has not been lost on educational institutions who have taken note and who are using media or taking media up as a site to remedy injustice. So they're doing a lot of work with historically marginalized populations, historically marginalized young people and communities, and in these programs that use media to remedy or to work with some of that marginalization, there's a real central focus on voice as the mode that will allow for change to happen and how young people what will allow young people to become empowered. So if you can just tell your story, we can work with it in such a way that we can deal with some of these issues of injustice. So because I'm concerned with media for social justice, how change happens is really, really central. And I'm really invested in questions of agency and empowerment and the role of voice in moving change forward. So in the case of my most recent research project, I was actually running a youth media program in Nicaragua called Amigos de las Americas. Amigos was partnering with Plan International. Together they were running a program that was bringing young people from the Dominican Republic, urban Nicaragua, and North America together in rural communities in Nicaragua to partner with local youth and to make a series of social justice videos and do some other kinds of social justice work with young people in those communities. So this project arose because I was the director of this program for several years, and after a couple of years, some of the young people from these communities came to me and said, you know, we really want to do a media project. We've noticed that all of the urban youth and Plan International's other programs are always doing media projects and we never get to. Could we make this a media project? So this program was born, and I ran it for a couple of years. So you might be asking, why cameras? Why centralized media and education or development work with young people? And why does how we frame young media, the media that we do with young people, matter? I would argue that there's extraordinary social justice potential in doing media work with young people, potential for democratic practice, for collaborative storytelling, access to global media networks and information circulation, really extraordinary multiliteracy benefits coming out of doing media work. And in order to think about what is going on, with these benefits and sometimes with the failures and in these programs, I use a mobilities lens, and that captures how young people knit together their digital stories through involvement with various publics, local publics, global publics, and knowledge practices. And it allows me to focus on the production process and relations of power, so race, colonialism, gender, as they play out in media production and as they shape what it is that young people are able to produce. So those are some of the issues that I'll discuss in this video, and that I'll give you some examples and kind of build out that framework a bit more. So what I noticed, I was running my Amigos program, and something that I've noticed in other youth media programs that I've run, well, is a couple of things. So first of all, there's a real focus on individual story as responsible for affecting change. So even though stories are almost never belong to one participant, rather they're much more relational, drawn from pop culture, knit together from different people's stories, retold, somebody heard something and then they made it into a story. And that secondly, there was a real slippage between how we talk about youth media production and young people's actual lived experiences of youth media production. And part of that, I think, is related to the fact that there's a lot of celebratory discourses around technology and young people, and when we work with those discourses, we end up retelling the stories where young people really, really are successful in doing critical engagement with media. And in reality, oftentimes young people are successful, and oftentimes there's a lot more complex stuff happening. Sometimes there's no electricity, the media breaks, the story doesn't work, the young people get into a fight over what they're going to produce. And I discovered in looking at some of those more complex stories that there's really a lot happening in the production process itself. That when we focus so heavily on voice and on the ability to tell a narrative, we really lose what's happening. So what came out of my work with this program was a research project that was a 2-year multi-sited ethnographic process where I really focused on the way that media production moves through different sites. So looking at the site of production where young people are coming up with their story, working together, collaborating, drawing on various networks in order to tell stories, the site of the artifact, that's the actual video itself that they make, and then the site of audiencing, where I looked at the way that nonprofits interact with their piece, the way that other youth receive their piece, what young people do with their piece. Do they put it on Facebook and then nobody ever watches it? Do they put it on YouTube and it gets a bunch of hits? Maybe, but mostly not. So I was really focusing on how youth navigate programming and how they're mobile in their relationship with media, nonprofit, transnational ideology, pop culture. So why agency? Why mobilities? Why democratic practice when we're thinking about youth and media, and what do I mean by that? When I say democratic practice, I'm referencing back to my theoretical framework, which is based in post-structural feminist work on media and pedagogy, specifically thinking about Linda Zerilli's work on democratic practice and the struggle over meaning itself, where democratic practice is conceptualized as the struggle over meaning itself, not the individual ability to affect change. So in youth media, the focus on democratic practice and the struggle over meaning means really looking at how young people negotiate storytelling, how they negotiate networks and access networks in order to get stories and remediate stories, and how they work together in kind of a public space with each other and with other constituents. So one goal of this work is to really problematize the emancipatory discourses surrounding youth media production. Not that youth media production is hopeless, I would actually say it's quite hopeful, but to suggest a framework for theorizing youth and media that centralizes the transnational relationships that shape youth engagements with media and technology. So when young people make media, and here I'm going to get into some examples, they draw on various networks, global networks, local networks that are enabled by transnational media. So media networks, we know, are a very powerful site to engage both local and global publics, and as globalization intensifies, there are more networks facilitating more connectivity. So I had one group of youth working together in the community of Los Limones, and they reproduced Pocahontas. So we're here in a critical media literacy program, and I have young people reproducing Pocahontas. And well, it's a bit more complicated than just reproducing Pocahontas. So they had a big meeting, and some of the Nicaraguan youths were saying, oh, there's this telenovela on, it's about race, it's got a biracial couple in it, and they're not allowed to be together, kind of a Romeo and Juliet kind of story. And they were saying, there's that telenovela, and we're in this relationship right now with this urban young woman from Nicaragua and these white young people from North America, and it's kind of like that because we're in a biracial friendship. Let's do something about race. So as they go through and they're talking about it, one of the North American young people says, oh my gosh, it sounds like Pocahontas. Let's do that. And they go, oh, what's Pocahontas? We haven't seen it. The youth hadn't seen Pocahontas. So the American youth narrated the story and told them the Disney story, and that's an important piece here. He narrated the Disney story, and they said, oh, that sounds great, let's do that. So they kind of just went down the path then of making Pocahontas. And you can see in that example how they're drawing on various networks in order to narrate that story. So they're drawing on the telenovela network, the local media network, they're drawing on a Disney media network. And Pocahontas, of course, is a very colonial story of rape that was retold by Disney to be a story of multiculturalism. So it's significant that then the North American young person thinks of that Disney story, which has already been remediated in particular ways, as his reference point for race. So they draw on all of these networks and all of these contexts in order to tell the story, and then it gets situated as the story of the young people in Nicaragua as though it's their story. And I want to clarify that it's not as if they hadn't reproduced media from from pop culture, they might have made something more authentic, but rather that there are no authentic stories. And the examples from pop culture, or this example, really illustrates how young people draw on various stories in order to remediate, or various sources in order to remediate their stories. Now, what's troubling about what happens when the nonprofit then reads this video as the story of the Nicaraguan youth is that assumptions about the lives of Nicaraguan young people become fixed to pop cultural narratives that have already been redrawn, in particularly racist, gendered, and colonial ways. So, like in the case of Pocahontas, and then is replicated in media for civic engagement programming and read as voice by the nonprofit and those in charge. So I really want to emphasize that there is quite a bit of social justice potential here. There's just a real problem in the centralizing of voice, where the individual has such a significant role in affecting change, moving change forward. So if those young people could just tell their own story, which now they've done because they made Pocahontas, something will change is the idea here. And I'm attempting to look more closely at what's going on with how they're accessing networks and how they produce the kind of relational production of that story. So there are, of course, many multimodal benefits of access to media programming and production. And in the case of Pocahontas, we see young people discussing racialized stories, writing a script, directing, asking for help, sharing the video with others, doing all kinds of critical, multimodal kind of literacy work so that is necessary. Those are skills that they need to have in order to participate in civic engagement. And it's for that reason that educational scholars call for these kinds of learning experiences for young people to develop transnational civic engagement skills. They still got those learning skills even though they reproduced Pocahontas. So it's here in this area where I really want to be able to focus on these learning experiences that I turn to mobilities in order to foreground the negotiation of meaning in transnational civic engagement and tell a really complex story about literacy and power and engagement. So typically in youth and media, there's a real focus on agency as the kind of guiding framework that we use to think about how young people are doing media for social justice, why they're doing media for social justice. It's really driven by agency. And I instead want to focus on a mobilities lens. So let me just go through what some of the differences between focusing on agency versus focusing on mobilities are. So with an agency lens, there's a real focus on production of individual story as linked to social change. So let's just get these youth to make a story about their lives, and that will somehow spur some real significant change. Agency situates technologies themselves as liberating or revolutionary. Persistent panoptimism about participation with technology and media. And we see this where there's lots of celebratory discourses around technology's ability to let young people access knowledge, become producers, become engaged in various social change discourses, civic engagement. Agency really foregrounds those technology experiences that map onto those positive and hopeful constructs, but really obscures other experiences that might not be so hopeful. And there's a real focus on end production, or the focus on end production really obscures the very complex and creative literacy activities of participants during production. So on the other hand, mobilities, there's a real focus on how stories are woven together with multiple voices and crafted from various sources, a focus on how stories move through publics. Situates technologies as designed to privilege particular bodies, highlights how young people move around through and with these designs. There's a focus on how media production energy emerges out of relationships between young people, media, nonprofits, schools, programs, global and local networks. And finally, it makes visible the creative ways that young people navigate nonprofit and global media systems and the relationships that they bring into media production. So, with that said, I think I will leave you with the video. So this is just a very simple, short stop-motion animation that will give you another example from my work similar to the Pocahontas story. In the community of Villa de Ada, in Boaco, Nicaragua, Plan International was facilitating a running water project with local community leaders. The project was urgent because river water that the community was drinking from was contaminated by arsenic and people were getting very sick. arsenic was being released into the water several miles upstream by a Canadian gold mining corporation. The Nicaraguan government is the only one in Latin America that allows for foreign gold mining. The funding for the water project came from a German donor through Plan International. The Amigos Media Project was also running in Villa de Ada, and Plan was a partner. Plan really wanted the youth to produce a video about the water project, a video that could be sent to the donor as a thank you, a video that would evidence youth civic engagement. The youth were totally uninterested, and they actually resisted for about 2 years before they finally gave in and made the piece. They produced a story about a family whose young daughter died from drinking bad water, a story that ended with development agencies leading a water project and the community extending effusive thank yous. They titled the piece La Contaminación, the contamination. There was no mention of gold miners, no mention of colonial funding relationships, and no mention of the youth's earlier indifference and resistance. The video was applauded as an instance of youth voice, of youth civic engagement, of youth being involved just as they should be in their community. So what happened here? How did they come to make that video? Is it an example of youth agency? Or how else might we understand what happened? Might there be a way to think about this video that accounts for how youth navigated very diverse and complex global and local relationships? Let's see, we've got Canadian gold miners using machines in the river that release arsenic. We've got Plan receiving funding from a German donor. We've got Amigos, which has placed 3 American teens and tons of video equipment in the community to make videos with local youth. We've got local youth who have been asked by community leaders and Plan to make a video about the water project, and we've got local youth who have learned how to produce a story that fits exactly what a foreign donor might want to see so that they would continue giving funding. Those youth were navigating complex transnational relationships and knowledge practices as they produced La Contaminación. I use a mobilities lens to think about the conditions of possibility for this project precisely because it highlights how young people move with, around, and through global and local networks that include transnational development and funding relationships, insistence on the power of media production to affect social change, local community leadership and government dynamics, and international gold mining practices and policies. The production of La Contaminación in Villa de Ada is a fascinating map of the various networks that young people engaged in order to make digital stories. So thanks for watching. I guess kind of in conclusion, and thinking a little bit about Villa de Ada and that story about the water, and how young people moved through and navigated that story. Mobilities as a framing concept for media participation and what they did really foregrounds the social, cultural, textual, historical relationships that shape the conditions of possibility for youth media makers, both at the level of local networks and what's happening between nonprofits and community leaders and young people and organizations that come in, and also at the global network where they're drawing on stories or getting funding from a particular agency. And mobility as an analytic tool for thinking about this kind of engagement really emphasizes that relationality and the creative literacy practices that young people rely on in order to produce within and move through these complex networks. Thanks. Bye.